Millbrook from surrounding towns. People drove in specifically to see the hourly man, expecting some kind of theatrical spectacle, but they were inevitably disappointed by the sheer ordinariness of what they witnessed. A man standing in the street, nothing more. This anticlimax proved more effective than any dramatic explanation could have been in dampening the wave of external interest. What few people understood was that Thomas's behavior was rooted in something deeper than eccentricity or mental illness, though it certainly might have appeared to be either or both to the casual observer. Thomas had spent 40 years as a structural engineer, designing buildings and bridges, calculating loads and stresses, ensuring that the physical infrastructure of the world remained stable and sound. He'd been good at this work, respected in his field, and he had built a career that was conventional in its excellence. He had married, had children, owned a home with a mortgage he had dutifully paid down over decades. And then, one day, while standing on the observation deck of a building he had helped design, watching the city spread out below him in all its geometric complexity, something had simply shifted in his perception of reality. He had realized, in that moment, standing 30 stories above the street, that his entire life had been predicated on a fundamental misunderstanding. He had believed that he was building things, creating structures that would persist and serve humanity. But what he had actually been doing was arranging dead matter into temporary configurations that would eventually crumble, rust, erode, and return to their component elements. The buildings would fall, the bridges would collapse. Everything he had labored to construct was merely a stay against the inevitable dissolution that awaited all things. More than this, he had come to understand that the same principle applied to everything else he had done. He had raised children who would grow old and eventually die. He had loved his wife, and she too would not persist. He had accumulated possessions, learned skills, developed opinions, all of which were equally temporary, equally meaningless in the face of infinite time. This realization, rather than driving him into despair, had instead produced a peculiar kind of peace. If nothing mattered, then everything was relieved of the burden of mattering. If all things were temporary, then there was no need to struggle against their temporality. This perspective had led him to retire from his engineering practice, though he was only in his early 60s. His children had been baffled by this decision, his wife had been concerned, and his friends had attempted to convince him that he was throwing away the best years of his life. But Thomas had seen that he had already thrown away those years, that he threw away every moment by insisting on its significance. He had begun his hourly vigil as a kind of meditation on this understanding. By standing in the street at exact hourly intervals, he was marking time in its most literal form. Every hour was the same, every hour was unique. Every hour he stood there, the world changed around him, but he remained constant. Cars passed, people walked by, the light shifted across the asphalt, clouds moved through the sky, yet his position remained the same. It was a study in the nature of change and permanence, a living koan about the relationship between the observer and the observed. He was simultaneously doing nothing and doing something profound. He was making a statement. By refusing to make a statement, the townspeople of Millbrook had begun to adjust their schedules around Thomas's presence. Shop owners on Brennan Street would glance at their watches to anticipate his arrival. The crossing guard who worked near the elementary school had incorporated his presence into her safety protocols, using his appearance as a signal that it was time to begin her duties again. The mailman who delivered to the downtown businesses had long since stopped being startled by finding Thomas in the street and had instead developed a kind of routine respect for the man, waiting patiently at a safe distance until Thomas's 3 minutes had elapsed. The town had begun to synchronize itself to Thomas's rhythm, though most people would not have articulated it in these terms. They would have said only that they had gotten used to him. that he was part of the furniture now. There were, of course, moments of tension. During the winter months, the mayor had been approached by concerned citizens who worried that Thomas might suffer from exposure or frostbite. A proposal had been made to install a heated waiting area for him off the street, but Thomas had given no indication that he wanted or needed such an accommodation. The police chief, a compassionate man named Derek Holbrook, had checked in with Thomas's family, concerned about his welfare and whether there might be some medical issue that needed addressing. Thomas's daughter, Sarah, had explained that her father was fine, that he was simply going through a philosophical phase, and that he had explicitly requested not to be interrupted in his pursuit of whatever it was he was pursuing. She did not sound angry, only somewhat bewildered, as if she had learned to accept her father's behavior without ever truly understanding it. As the seasons changed and the years accumulated, Thomas's presence became less a curiosity and more a fixture. New residents moving to Millbrook would be informed of his existence by friends or neighbors with the kind of tone one might use to describe a local landmark. "Oh yes, we have the Hourly Ma Inn on Brennan Street. You'll see him standing there every hour, right in the middle of the road. Nobody knows why. He doesn't talk, but he's harmless." This description was accurate enough, though it captured almost nothing of what Thomas's presence actually meant to the town, or what it meant to Thomas himself. There were those who tried to divine meaning from his vigil. A philosophy professor from the university in the next town over had stopped by regularly to observe and occasionally attempt conversations about Thomas's methodology. A Buddhist meditation group had adopted him as an object of study, seeing in his hourly practice a reflection of mindfulness and detachment from desire. A Christian pastor had suggested to Thomas that his behavior might represent a kind of prayer or spiritual practice, and had offered to discuss it with him in the relative privacy of the church. None of these interpretations seemed to move Thomas in any visible way. He continued his hourly vigil unchanged and unchanging, responding to the world's attempts to explain him with the same quiet absence of response. The turning of the seasons marked time in ways that Thomas's hourly standing could not. The snow would pile up in the winter, and Thomas would stand in it, his shoes collecting the white dampness but his posture never wavering. The spring rains would come, and his clothes would gradually become soaked, yet he would not seek shelter or expedite his 3-minute window. The summer heat would make the asphalt shimmer with potential mirage, and still he would stand patient and immobile. The fall leaves would eddy around his feet, and he would remain as much a permanent fixture as the street itself. The cycle repeated year after year, and the townspeople of Millbrook began to feel that they were living in a different kind of world, one where a man could stand in a street every hour. Oh, the hour, and this was simply how reality worked in their particular corner of existence. Some residents of Millbrook began to claim that Thomas's presence was good for the town. Crime had decreased, they said, or perhaps they imagined it had. The spiritual atmosphere felt different, more contemplative, more aware of the present moment. Property values, they suggested, might actually be higher because of the peculiar character that Thomas added to the downtown area. This was almost certainly not true, but it was the kind of truth that communities construct to explain the inexplicable elements of their shared experience. Thomas had become a story Millbrook told itself, a narrative that bound the community together in shared acknowledgement of something outside the ordinary. There were occasionally confrontations, though they were rare. A businessman who was perpetually rushed had once yelled at Thomas to get off the street, that he was a traffic hazard and a menace. A teenage boy trying to impress his friends had thrown a soda can toward Thomas, who had neither dodged nor reacted, simply watching as the can rolled across the asphalt. But these moments of discord were exceptions. Most people, most of the time, had simply accepted Thomas as part of the landscape, the way one accepts that birds will sing or that the sun will set. What nobody in Millbrook could know was what Thomas actually thought about during his 3 minutes in the street each hour. They could not know that he was counting breaths, calibrating his awareness to the rhythm of his own physiology. They could not know that he was observing the precise moment when cars would see him and begin to slow, the exact point at which human perception shifted from ignorance to recognition. They could not know that he was conducting an extended experiment in presence, in what it meant to exist fully in one location, fully in one moment, stripped of all purpose or intention beyond the mere fact of existing. They could not know that he found this deeply meaningful, or that he found it utterly meaningless, and that he had come to understand that these were not contradictory positions. Years continued to pass. Thomas aged as all people age, his silver hair becoming thinner, his movements becoming slightly more labored, yet his commitment to his hourly vigil never wavered. The townspeople of Millbrook watched this aging process with something approaching affection, as one watches a beloved landmark slowly show signs of wear. When a particularly severe winter came, there were genuine concerns about whether Thomas would survive the cold, standing as he did in the open street for 3 minutes every hour. But Thomas had proven more resilient than such concerns suggested. He simply endured as he had endured all the previous winters, all the previous summers, all the previous seasons of change and return. The children who had been young when Thomas first began his vigil had now grown into teenagers and young adults. Some of them could barely remember a time before the hourly man was part of their world. They had grown up synchronizing their perception of time to his regular interventions in the street. For them, Thomas was not a curiosity but a constant, a given element of their reality, as permanent and inevitable as gravity. When they left Millbrook for college or work, they would find themselves occasionally thinking of Thomas, wondering if he was still standing there, still marking the hours, still conducting his silent vigil in the center of Brennan Street. And he was. He continued day after day, year after year, in his quiet dedication to a practice that nobody else fully understood, but everyone had come to respect. In a world of constant noise, constant distraction, constant dema, for productivity and meaning and result, Thomas had created a space of pure being, of absolute presence in the moment, of a 3-minute withdrawal from the demands of conventional existence that repeated itself with metronomic regularity. Whether this was profound or pointless, healing or harmful, became less and less important as the years accumulated. What mattered was simply that he was there, that he had committed to something beyond the understanding of those who observed him, and that he maintained this commitment with a steadiness that had become almost beautiful in its constancy. The man stood in the road every hour on the hour, and the world, in its mysterious way, had learned to accommodate itself around this simple, extraordinary fact. A man in the road continued. The rhythms of Thomas's life had become so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of Millbrook's daily existence that it was difficult to imagine the town functioning without him. The local high school had even incorporated his presence into a social studies project, with students studying the phenomenon of community acceptance and the role of ritual in establishing social order. Some of these students had interviewed Thomas's neighbors, spoken with shop owners, and compiled their observations into a comprehensive report that theorized about the psychological and sociological implications of his behavior. None of this external analysis seemed to penetrate the quiet sphere of consciousness within which Thomas operated. He remained fundamentally untouched by the attention, unmoved by the interpretations and theories that swirled around him. What had changed, subtly but significantly, was the way that Thomas himself was changing. The aging process, while not visible in any dramatic way, was nonetheless occurring in the background of his continued practice. His 3-minute windows were sometimes no, occupied by a slight shifting of weight, a barely perceptible adjustment of posture that suggested his body was experiencing strain. The dedication remained absolute, but the physical cost of that dedication was beginning to register. The townspeople noticed this in the way that people notice things without articulating them consciously. They noticed that Thomas's face was becoming more aligned, that his movements were becoming marginally slower, that the vitality which had sustained him through decades of disciplined practice was perhaps beginning to dim, however, infinitesimally. There was a young woman named Claire who worked at the coffee shop on Brennan Street, directly across from where Thomas would stand during his hourly vigils. She had taken a job there 3 years ago, fresh out of high school, uncertain about her direction in life, and somewhat aimless in her pursuits. She had lived in Millbrook her entire life, so Thomas had been a constant presence throughout her childhood and adolescence, but it was only once she began working at the coffee shop that she truly paid attention to him. Something about the regularity of her own schedule. The morning shift starting at 6, the hourly cycles of the day marked by the opening and closing of the shop, the rhythmic flow of customers and lulls, had attuned her to Thomas's presence in a deeper way. She had begun, without consciously deciding to do so, to mark his arrival. At 6 a.m., she would brew the morning coffee, and at exactly 6 a.m., Thomas would appear in the street. At 7 a.m., she would open the register, and at 7 a.m., Thomas would take his position. There was a synchronicity to it that struck her as almost musical, a kind of duet between her work and his practice. She had never spoken to him, had never attempted to initiate a conversation, but she developed a sense of connection simply through the shared rhythm of their days. On days when she called in sick, or when the shop was closed, she would feel a slight disorientation, as though some essential component of her day had been removed. One morning, as Claire was preparing the shop for the day ahead, she had noticed that Thomas had not appeared at his usual time. 6 o'clock came and went, and the street remained empty of his presence. 7 o'clock arrived, and still no sign of him. She felt a small flutter of concern, though she could not have fully explained why. It was as though a clock had stopped ticking, as though some fundamental assumption about the nature of reality had been violated. She had asked other regulars who came in for their morning coffee if they had seen him, and they had all reported the same thing. Thomas had not appeared. The consensus was that he was likely ill, or perhaps had decided to take a day off, though the idea of Thomas taking a day off seemed almost absurd given the unchanging consistency of his practice. By the afternoon, various theories had begun to circulate throughout Millbrook. Some people wondered if he had finally had some kind of medical incident, if his age and the physical strain of standing in the street in all weather had finally caught up with him. Others speculated that his practice had perhaps served its purpose, that he had achieved whatever philosophical or spiritual goal he had been pursuing, and was now moving on to another phase of his life. A few more cynical residents suggested that he had simply grown bored, or that the novelty of his behavior had worn off and he had returned to normalcy. The police chief, Derek Holbrook, made the decision to check on Thomas's welfare, driving out to his address on the outskirts of town to ensure that the man was all right. What Derek found was reassuring, or at least it clarified the situation. Thomas answered the door, looking tired but otherwise healthy. When Derek expressed his concern about Thomas not appearing in the street that morning, Thomas simply nodded, his eyes carrying that same distant quality they always possessed. Derek tried to ask if there was a problem, if Thomas needed assistance of some kind, but Thomas did not respond with words. Instead, he had simply closed the door gently, leaving Derek standing on the porch with his questions unanswered. Derek returned to the police station and reported to anyone who asked that Thomas appeared to be fine, that he had simply taken a break. But Derek himself wondered if something more had changed, if Thomas's commitment to his practice might finally be wavering. By the next morning, however, Thomas had returned. At 6 o'clock precisely, he appeared in the street, standing in his customary position, his eyes fixed on that distant point that only he could perceive. There was no explanation for his absence, no indication that anything was different except for the fact that he had been absent. Claire, working her morning shift at the coffee shop, felt a profound sense of relief when she saw him. She realized in that moment how much his presence mattered to her, how central it had become to her sense of stability and order. She had not fully recognized this until the moment it was taken away. Over the following weeks, Claire began to notice other things about Thomas, details that she had perhaps always seen but never fully registered. She noticed that he wore the same jacket in the winter, a gray wool coat that had faded in spots from years of use. She noticed that his shoes, while always polished, were the same pair that he had worn for at least the past 3 years. She noticed that on days when the wind blew particularly hard, his body would shift almost imperceptibly into the wind, adjusting to its force, but never breaking his stance. She noticed that in the summer, when the heat was intense, his face would sometimes show signs of strain, beads of perspiration appearing on his forehead, yet he would not waver from his position. The coffee shop where Claire worked had become, in an odd way, a kind of shrine to Thomas's practice. Regular customers would come in and ask if Claire had noted anything unusual about Thomas that day. Conversations would naturally drift to him, to speculation about his motivations and his experience. The owner of the coffee shop, a woman named Margaret, who had run the establishment for nearly 15 years, had remarked to Claire that she had never seen anything quite like what had happened to their downtown area. The presence of a single man conducting a single incomprehensible action with absolute regularity had somehow unified the community in ways that nothing else had managed to do. There was something almost sacred about it, she had said, though she could not quite explain what she meant by that. As the 3rd anniversary of Thomas's practice approached, the local newspaper had decided to do a more in-depth feature. They had interviewed dozens of residents, examined traffic patterns to see if there had been any measurable impact on flow, surveyed property values and business receipts, and attempted once again to contact Thomas directly for a statement. The resulting article was surprisingly moving, not because it solved any mysteries about Thomas, but because it documented the effect that his presence had had on the community. The article noted that Thomas had become something of a symbol, though a symbol of what remained unclear. He was a symbol of constancy in a world of change, or perhaps a symbol of resistance to the constant pressure to be productive and efficient and meaningful. He was a symbol of the sacred, a reminder that not everything in the modern world needed to be explained or justified or made to serve a purpose. Thomas himself, when confronted with a copy of the article, had shown no visible reaction. It was left by the coffee shop owner on the counter one day, with a note suggesting that Thomas might find it interesting. The next time Thomas appeared in the street, the article was no longer there, but whether he had read it and what he might have thought of it remained unknown. His practice continued unchanged, as it always had, unaffected by external commentary or interpretation. He stood in the street every hour on the hour for 3 minutes, and then he retreated to the sidewalk to wait for the next hour to arrive. The relationship between Claire and Thomas had, over time, developed a complexity that neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. Claire had begun to anticipate his arrival with a kind of spiritual focus, clearing her mind and preparing herself to witness his practice. Sometimes, during their shared 3-minute window, she would step outside the coffee shop and stand on the opposite side of the street, not speaking, not attempting any kind of interaction, but simply present in her own way. Thomas never looked at her directly, but Claire had come to believe that he was aware of her presence in the way that two practitioners of meditation might be aware of each other without direct communication. There was a kind of mutual recognition that went beyond words or conventional social interaction. One evening, after she had closed the coffee shop for the day, Claire had made a decision. She'd always been curious about the point that Thomas stared at, the distant focus of his gaze that seemed to contain something that the rest of the world could not perceive. She had positioned herself on the street, attempting to look down the line of his sight, trying to understand what he saw. The street continued for several blocks, lined with buildings and street lamps and the ordinary fixtures of a small town's downtown area. Beyond that, the street climbed a slight hill and disappeared from view. There was nothing exceptional about it, nothing that would suggest why this particular vista would capture Thomas's attention so completely. When Thomas had appeared at the next hour, Claire was still standing there, still puzzling over what he might see. When he took his position, his eyes passing over her without registering acknowledgement, she had felt a moment of disappointment. And yet, as she continued to stand there, she had begun to understand something. Perhaps the point that Thomas stared at was not actually a point in space. Perhaps what he was looking at was not visible to the physical eye, but rather something that existed in a realm that only years of practice and dedication could reveal. Perhaps the street itself was not the true subject of his attention, but rather the emptiness that contained the street, the void that underlay all visible phenomena. This realization had struck Claire with the force of a revelation. She had stood on the street for the remainder of Thomas's 3-minute window, no longer trying to see what he saw, but rather allowing herself to simply be present in the moment, to stand in the same space that he occupied, breathing the same air, existing in the same temporal moment. When his 3 minutes were complete and he retreated to the sidewalk, she had felt a strange sense of completion, as though she had participated in something meaningful without fully understanding its meaning. She had walked back to the coffee shop and closed up for the night, feeling changed in some ineffable way. The relationship between Thomas and the town continued to deepen and transform. New businesses had actually chosen to locate on Brennan Street specifically because of his presence, though they would have found it difficult to articulate why. A boutique bookstore had opened, specializing in philosophy and spiritual texts. A yoga studio had established itself 2 blocks away from where Thomas stood. A meditation center had been founded by a group of individuals who felt called to create a space that honored what Thomas's practice represented. None of this had been orchestrated or planned. It had simply happened organically, as though Thomas's presence was calling forth complementary energies and interests. Thomas himself had become, in a very real way, the focal point of Millbrook's identity. When people from other towns asked a Millbrook resident what made their community special, the hourly man was frequently one of the first things mentioned. The town had even begun to see his presence as a kind of brand, a distinguishing characteristic that set Millbrook apart from the countless other small towns scattered across the landscape. There had been tentative discussions about creating a small plaza where Thomas could perform his practice with perhaps a bit more comfort, maybe a specially marked area that acknowledged his importance to the community. But when this proposal had been mentioned to Thomas's daughter, Sarah, she had gently discouraged it. "My father," she had said, "is not interested in being honored or memorialized. He wants only to continue his practice. Any change to his circumstances would be a disruption to what he has spent years building. This response had been somewhat surprising to those who had proposed the plaza, but it also felt right. Thomas's practice derived much of its meaning precisely from its unadorned simplicity, its lack of accommodation or special consideration. He stood in the street, the same street that others drove and walked on, exposed to the elements and the weather and the indifference of ordinary life. This was essential to what he was doing. To create a special space for him would be to diminish the practice, to mark it as separate and special when the power of it lay precisely in its ordinariness. As Thomas approached his mid-70s, the question of what would happen if he was no longer able to continue became increasingly pressing. Some residents privately wondered if the town should be preparing for a future without him, though the thought of such a future seemed almost unimaginable. The hourly man had become so much a part of Millbrook's identity and daily rhythm that his eventual absence would leave a void that nothing could adequately fill. There were those who suggested, semi-seriously, that someone should take up the practice after Thomas was no longer able to continue, that the ritual could be passed down like a sacred trust to the next generation. But everyone understood on some level that such a substitution would not be the same. The power of Thomas's practice lay partly in the fact that it was Thomas, a specific person with a specific history and a specific commitment to a practice that nobody else fully understood. Thomas, for his part, gave no indication that he was concerned about the future or about his own mortality. He continued to appear every hour, in all seasons, in all weather, with a consistency that bordered on the supernatural. His body was aging, yes, but his commitment appeared to have become, if anything, more resolute, as though the very fragility of his physical form had strengthened his psychological dedication. He was racing against time, perhaps, though the word racing did not quite capture the quality of his slow, patient march through the hours and days and years. What the townspeople of Millbrook could not have known was that Thomas had come to understand something that very few people ever truly grasp. He had come to see that the practice was not about achieving anything, not about building towards some future state of enlightenment or understanding. The practice was the understanding. Every hour that he stood in the street was complete in itself, whole and perfect, and requiring nothing beyond itself. The accumulation of these hours, the repetition of this action day after day and year after year, had transformed him. Or rather, it had revealed something about him that had always been present. He had become, in a very real sense, timeless. He existed in the eternal now, the eternal present that contained all past and all future within itself. This transformation was not visible to the outside world, or rather, it was visible only as an intensification of the qualities that had always characterized him: his silence, his steadiness, his absolute presence in the moment. But internally, Thomas had transcended the conventional understanding of self. He was no longer waiting for something to happen. He was no longer becoming. He was simply being, hour after hour, standing in the street, completely present to the moment and to whatever that moment contained. And in this simple being, this absolute presence, he had found something more profound than any achievement or accomplishment could have offered. He had found peace, or perhaps more accurately, he had found the peace that underlaid all the motion and change of existence. The town of Millbrook, without fully understanding what was happening, had begun to share in some aspect of this peace. The frenetic energy that characterizes so many modern communities seemed somehow diminished here, replaced by a quality of patience and acceptance. People moved more slowly through downtown, not because they were forced to, but because the presence of the hourly man seemed to invite a slower pace of living. Conversations became more meaningful, more contemplative. There was a sense that something important was happening here, something that deserved to be witnessed and honored even if it could never be fully explained. Years continued to accumulate. The children who had grown up with Thomas as a constant presence were now becoming adults with children of their own. Grandparents would bring their grandchildren to the coffee shop at specific hours, pointing out the window toward where Thomas stood, telling stories about how he had been doing this for as long as they could remember. The temporal perspective shifted subtly. For the oldest residents, Thomas was a relatively recent phenomenon, addition to their landscape in their later years. For the middle-aged, he was simply a constant. For the young, he was the only reality they had ever known. The idea that Millbrook had once been a town without the hourly man seemed almost absurd, a piece of history that was hard to reconcile with present reality. And still, Thomas stood. Every hour, on the hour, he appeared in the street. His presence had become so integrated into the town's consciousness that it required no explanation, no justification. He was simply part of the fabric of existence in Millbrook, as essential and unremarkable as the pavement beneath his feet or the sky above his head. The man stood in the road every hour on the hour, and the world continued to turn around him, synchronized to his rhythm, moving to the beat of a drum that only he could fully hear, but that everyone had learned to dance to in their own way.